we go. So first of all, a warm welcome and thank you so much for joining us today in what is this discussion around that intersectionality between financial well-being and ED&I. My name is Nuz Shagan and I am part of the leadership team for Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing. I've been there at the start of the stage, and it was the brainchild of Ryan Briggs, who unfortunately isn't able to make it today. And it was a group of people that came together to really learn and share from best practice. As you can imagine, we were during a pandemic and we realized there was a big gap in understanding what this remit that previously sat perhaps on the back burner came to life, and really understanding what it meant. Financial well-being has been a big focus for Ryan and myself as well, purely because we understood long before there was a pandemic or a cost of living crisis that it is top of mind for many people, and it's one of the things that actually attributes to well-being. So Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing is a non-for-profit community interest company. This means that the company it's not designed to make massive loads of money or profit. We really generate our money and we grow the community to ensure that it's sustainable. We really rely on the support of our partners, and a big thank you to Business for Health, GoVox, the Jordan Legacy, Hayes, and of course, Margie that's here today to really support and bringing this together for us as well. I'm going to jump into our short introduction in terms of our agenda for today. So as you can see, it's quite packed. We've got welcome and introductions, and I've spoken about Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing. I have left a link in the chat box as well if you'd like to find out more, and I'll put it on at the end. I'll introduce our expert panel shortly as well, because we are amongst some great expertise here. We will have a Q&A, and I do ask now and reiterate it in the chat, is that if you could have your questions to hand and have a think about your questions and add them to the chat, we'll be able to take those questions at the Q&A. But please do, we do encourage as many people to have some questions. That's what we're here for, to learn and share from best practice, and how do we really move this agenda forward. So without further ado, I wanted to, of course, introduce my co-pilot for today. So Matt Castle. Matt is head of growth and D&I and sustainability at Margie. It's a holistic financial well-being provider, really focused on empowering employers to support all of their workforce through the cost of living crisis and beyond, especially those that are underrepresented or vulnerable. He's also a non-exec director of Bias Proof, which is a D&I tech, which aims at tackling unconscious bias in the workplace. And then an esteemed panelist today is Jitin Patel. Jitin founded a highly successful consultancy specializing in equality, diversity, and inclusion for a vast range of clients. So it's everything from national to local governments, blue chip companies, to small local charities. And through his coaching, events, training, and facilitating, he goes through the whole process development. So all aspects of your employment life cycle, if you like. His work has earned him some great accolades, including Diversity Champion and the highly commended Head of Diversity and Inclusion at the 2016 and 2017 UK Inclusive Company Awards. So thank you so much for being here. Our next panelist is Dr. Bejna Kotak, and Bejna has led strategy, transformation, R&D, and innovation for the financial services sector across UK, EMEA, the Americas, and Asia Pacific for over 2 decades. She's also a member of the United Nations Women UK delegation, and holds a number of advisory board roles, and serves as well as a host or judge for a portfolio of initiatives. So a very highly decorated international thought leader, and also featuring in numerous publications, having received a host of awards. So without a further ado, I'm going to hand to Matt to take us on further.
Thank you for that great introduction, Nuz. As Nuz said, my name is Matt Castle. My visual description is I'm a 6 foot tall white male with brown hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a blue and red pinstripe shirt. My pronouns are he, him. I'd like to start by echoing what Nuz said, saying that I'm really privileged to be co-hosting this session with such an esteemed panel. This will be the first in a series of events that aim to highlight the link between diversity, equity, inclusion, and financial well-being. And it's really fabulous that we have a capacity crowd today, and we have a real mix of audience in terms of geographies. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from today. We also have a really interesting mix of sectors, roles, and levels of experience in DE&I represented. So with that in mind, for those of you that are relatively new to DE&I, I'll kick off with my first question. What are the key differences between the terms equity, diversity, and inclusion, and how do they relate to minority ethnic employees? And I'd like to direct my first question to both of you, and I'll start with Bijna, if that's okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Matt. Really excited to be here and surrounded by such an incredible group. So Nuz, Matt, Jiten, really looking forward to this, and thank you. I think you ask an interesting question, because we used to refer to diversity, then it became diversity and inclusion. And in recent years, we've seen a real kind of shift towards diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so things have changed, but I will take it one step further, and I'll say that really what all of these attribute to in the workplace is, or even in a community, it's belonging. So you have, imagine 3 quadrants: inclusion, diversity, and equity. Where they overlap and the magic happens is where you've got all 3 sort of covering a zone, which is the belonging zone. And I'll kind of just spend a minute on explaining what that means. Inclusion is really about embracing and accepting ideas or perspectives that come from individual journeys or individual positioning. Diversity is about multiple identities represented within an organization. And then equity is constantly recognizing and redistributing power around that. So it's taking all of the different aspects of intersectionality, making them acceptable and represented, assimilating that into the culture of the organization, and then making sure that we need to redistribute and reallocate power or decision-making or authority in an equalized way. Where you've got all of these, you have an organization that basically is, in an ideal world, embracing the full potential of the individuals, allowing them to bring their true authentic selves to work, and their true views, beliefs, and values can be integrated. So if you are from a particular culture, you can wear what is representative of that culture. If you need time out to pray or fast, your organization and your role trusts you to be able to manage that and go and do it when you need to, but also come back and do your work when you need to, for example. And so for me, those are the distinguishing assets and descriptions of the DE&I quadrant, and when they come together, what they should equal.
Thank you for that fabulous answer, Bijna. If I could field the same question to Jiten, please.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, let me just start by saying thank you very much for the glowing introduction and for the privilege of being here this afternoon. I would say that, you know, in terms of what Bijna said, I would say ditto, 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 ditto. But just to add a little bit to it, I think when we start thinking about equity or equality as it used to be known, then we're really hitting the compliance level of this dynamic. And therefore, those organizations who want to only do the minimum will think about what do we need to do in terms of our national legislation, depending on whichever jurisdiction you happen to be in. When we start thinking about diversity, again, you know, we've talked about different identities that people carry, but often, you know, there are identities that people may want to hide. And therefore, what are we doing in terms of inclusion to create a culture that allows those individuals not to feel that they have to hide? And as Bijna mentioned, it's about belonging. And to create belonging, we have to really invest in creating a culture of psychological safety within the workplace and outside. And that psychological safety is really where each person feels that they have a voice, not only that they have a voice, but that voice is heard, and that then we are working in a space that gives them license to rise to their full potential.
Great answer. Thank you, Jiten. So to follow on from that, I guess the burning question is, why now? Why is the intersection between financial well-being and DE&I for minority ethnic employees such an important topic of conversation? Bijden, maybe you'd like to take that one.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and I think I'm just gonna kind of continue the thread that Jiten started, right, on psychological safety in the workplace, and kind of try and give you some examples basis that. So ultimately, we all understood diversity, we all understood the concept. For a lot of organizations, a lot of sectors, a lot of geographies, it was really a tick box exercise. And for me, for example, I've lived and worked in all different parts of the world in my career. And quite often I'd see, okay, there was legislation in the UK to track gender, race, ethnicity on a voluntary basis. When I lived in New York and worked around the States, it was just gender. If you tracked gender, you were tracking diversity. That was the be all and end all. Everything else was kind of irrelevant. And, you know, organizations had different circles, like a women's network or an LGBT network, but they weren't actually doing anything about it in terms of bringing that into the fabric of the culture of the organization. I think what happened through the pandemic, or at least in my view, is we had the Black Lives Matter movement. We had a complete shift in perspective and understanding of what psychological safety means. We started to hear the term, explore it. We started to see focus on mental health in the workplace from a lot of organizations, mental health in balancing your work-life balance. If you had an environment where work was happening at home and home life was happening at home as well. And really, the more we started to frame it, the more we started to actually look at the different strands of intersectionality, which Jiten talked about, the unique identifiers that are unique to us, our race, ethnicity, culture, orientation, gender, all of these attributes of our intersectionality, and say, right, how do we manage all these different attributes for our employees or for our colleagues, and actually allow them to work through known and unknown blockers in the workplace. And so that's really where there was a lot of research before, but I think that's really where we started to see some of this research come out in things like mainstream news or in television shows or in campaigns, for example, in marketing campaigns. I'm an ambassador for a charity called Surviving Economic Abuse. Now, economic empowerment and economic abuse are complete opposite ends of the spectrum. But if you're economically disempowered, you're more likely to be economically abused. And today you've got banks like, you know, some of the biggest chains in the UK saying, if somebody's taking your salary or if somebody's accessing your bank account and making transactions, that can be economic abuse. And therefore we recognize you as a vulnerable customer and we'll do something about it. But ultimately, historically and today, what we see is that ethnic minority populations from LGBT backgrounds, populations with disability, so vulnerable populations, are by far more likely than an average white middle-class independent individual to be economically disempowered. And they are also likely to be suffering some kind of mental health trauma because of their economic situation. And therefore, they are more likely to be impacted with mental health issues or relying on aid for physical health, because there is definitely a linkage. So, for example, women own less than a fraction of the world's wealth, but they contribute to almost half of the economic activity. Women, Black, Latino, LGBT populations, and those with disabilities in the US are reported in recent years to say consistently that they don't have enough money in the middle class segment to take care of unexpected expenses. So if you have a medical emergency, you they can't cope with it. And that is a strain, and debt is absolutely a strain. Closer to home in the UK, we are living through the cost of living crisis, which we talked about earlier. Recently, almost 70% of adults from an ethnic minority background reported that they felt stressed about finances, and that they didn't know how to deal with it, and it was affecting their home life and their mental health. The pandemic has created more inequality, and compared to their white counterparts, ethnic minority customers in the banking segment across the UK reported, 2/3 of them reported that they feel more stressed since the pandemic about money. The pandemic has also reduced the amount of savings that people now have in their accounts across different demographics, but the highest gap is seen in ethnic minorities. And then this research was really part of something that was looking to help individuals save between now and 2024. But what we're seeing is that poverty is on the rise, and ethnic minorities, LGBT, and vulnerable customers are actually worst hit. So the double-edged sword here is that when you are from an ethnic minority or from a group where you are a minority of any sort, there is a stigma with discussing economic disempowerment, and then there is a stigma with discussing mental well-being. And so it becomes extremely challenging, and translation of the real impact of these circumstances is difficult to pin down today, but ultimately organizations, whether you're a bank, whether you're an employer, are trying to bring in new ways of dealing with these challenges, but it's very clear and very evident. So now is, going back to your question, why now? Well, now is when we are most aware and informed and conscious about what's happening, and we are relying on the current day situation, which is relatively pressing in our lifetimes, to try and do something about it.
Fabulous. Thank you, Bijna. So Jiten, if I could direct my next question to you, please. Mm-hmm. What would you say are the key difficulties and challenges around implementing a DE&I program that takes into account financial well-being for minority ethnic employees?
Okay, so I think with that question, before I do that, I would say, just to add to what Bijna said in terms of why now, there's a fantastic thing about the ecosystems, which said that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Okay? And therefore, we need to deal with these things now, even though we should have dealt with them years and years ago. Mm. And then coming into this idea of the difficulties and challenges, I think the first one that comes to mind is the idea that money is a touchy subject. And especially amongst minority ethnic communities, it's something that perhaps would have been discussed within families, but not necessarily discussed at work. And as such, to get people to open up about the fact that actually I'm not doing too well right now it's got loaded with stigma, and Bijna touched on that as well. Also, people then, because they are sort of stigmatized by it, they can start feeling disenfranchised. When they're feeling disenfranchised, then it's like, well, I dare not share this aspect of my identity with my colleagues, because they might start thinking of me as a charity case. Mm. When actually, research from IPPR in the UK, for example, showed that significantly more people from minority ethnic backgrounds rent than have their own properties. And with the rental prices going up, the cost of living going up, and there is now increased stress. And so that affects people's mental health and well-being. That once my mental health is affected, then I'm perhaps likely not to be speaking about these things as much as previously. And secondly, there is such poor education around mental health and well-being that people do not know how to raise the subject in the workplace. So if I am a line manager, how do I then start to bring these issues up without making people feel stigmatized about it? And of course, when we start thinking about that, the person on the receiving end, and often these are people who are in minoritized communities, they often feel like, and this is a phrase I've heard time and time and time again, it's, I don't want to be given special preferences. Okay. And of course, it's not special preference, because in fairness, if we really are working to create consciously a culture of inclusion, then that means that this type of conversation, this information should be available to everybody, but that people should feel confident that they can ask about it, and that they can then receive the support that perhaps may be available. And perhaps coming into sort of more this idea of structural privilege, I'm sure that a lot of our people on the call today will be familiar with this topic, but structural privilege can lead to a lack of understanding on the part of the people who have that privilege. And so as a leader or a line manager, maybe they are not primed to notice whether staff perhaps actually have something to eat at lunchtime. Okay. And it sounds a little bit weird, but it's like everybody seems to be so busy with their job. They forget that, you know, a significant proportion of a leader's job is to look after their people. And so I think these are some of the, you know, principal challenges that people need to face up to.
Thanks, Jiten. Again, great answer. So moving on from that, I'll throw this question to both of you. What is your biggest piece of advice for employers getting started with such initiatives? And how do you get the entire company, including the leadership team, on board? And I'll start with Bijna, please.
I think this is a really interesting question. And I can't say there's going to be a one-fits-all strategy, because we have different organizations of different scales, sizes, and sectors. But what I'm going to highlight is, I think starting with intersectionality and mental health can be a good place to start. I gave a report during the pandemic for a magazine called Banking Frontiers in October 2021. And I really talked about the fact that the World Health Organization had come out with some research in the 90s that said that the world's most ruthless killer and greatest cause of suffering on earth is extreme poverty. With what happened through the pandemic and a lot more people from the middle income segment pushed into the poverty segment globally, we started to explore poverty as a multidimensional phenomenon. Now, I'm not saying we're all living in poverty, but what I am saying is we are living in poorer times than we were a few years ago, particularly pre-pandemic. And you just have to look at the economic parameters to see that anywhere in the world. I mean, every sort of quarter in the UK, we're just about skipping the recession line. And I think what happens with that is, and we look at things like, I mean, I was having a discussion with someone the other day, you know, the price of cheese has gone up sort of 4x, and, you know, the price of milk and all these sorts of things. But what this means is this multidimensional phenomenon that affects our lives, because we all grocery shop, we all live in this country, we're all impacted by the interest rates, means that we have a lack of control over our resources to some extent. We can no longer categorize what's going to be fixed income, what's going to be variable income when that income comes in. We also then have to compromise on things like education or health. And so, and health can be simple things like, let's go and buy the junk food because it's cheaper and we've still got to make ends meet, for example, which is a very real thing. So what happens is we end up through this phenomenon in a way of life that's intrinsically alienating and distressing, and alienating because, like Jiten and I have already discussed, these are not things we're going to share with many people. We're going to try and just sort of brush them under the carpet because we're all just trying to do the best that we can do and carry on. But this leads to behavioral and psychiatric issues or symptoms consciously and subconsciously. And then what happens is that we start to see these behaviors and these symptoms translate into the world in different ways, and definitely into the workplace. So we start to see people bring that frustration, which could actually be symptomatic of depression or of anxiety or of stress in different ways. And therefore that then starts to explode, and we see things like domestic abuse, we see microaggressions, we see bias, conscious and subconscious. We see communities trying to dominate each other. We see people who are at risk. We see thoughts of suicide. We see all sorts of things going on, and we know that they're red flags, but we don't necessarily know how to address them. And so going back to the question, where I'm going with this is the breadth, depth, and spread of the impact to mental health of every single employee is very real. Because even if we choose to ignore it and we've got enough savings to get through the rest of our lives, we're still living through difficult times where people around us are impacted. That's the best case scenario. So on a conscious and subconscious level, we're taking information in from the news, from people around us, from these posters that we see, marketing campaigns. We are all being impacted. And I think the best place that organizations can start to make change is, one, to create that psychological safety in the workplace, but two, create some level of provision around mental health. And once you're able to distinguish whether it's anxiety or stress or concerns or biases or aggressions, then start to take a top-down approach in each of those verticals and how to address that and help alleviate some of those concerns and press points, so that you do then continue that journey of psychological safety at work. Because a lot of people can't be themselves at home, they're carrying the responsibility. But if we can let them feel void of carrying that heavy weight on their shoulders at work, it'll create that psychological safety, and it will also encourage more positive behaviors, which then go back outside of work into their respective lives. So I feel that it's got a dual impact.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bijna. And I'll pass the same question to Jiten.
Thanks, Bijna. And just sort of thank you for setting the macroeconomic scenario there as well, because that allows me to perhaps drill down a little bit more into the detail. And I would say 3 words came to my mind when you were talking about this question. It's about raising awareness. So awareness, educate, and then implement. So if we if I was giving a company some advice, I'd say start raising awareness around the issues of well-being and finances as well, and think about it. Which are the communities that are most severely affected by these issues? And that gives us rise to then thinking about what actions we can take. So we educate our workforce and to help them to start being a little bit more sensitive. And sometimes, people think being sensitive is not a strong element of being a good business person. And I would disagree with that, because when I'm sensitive in that way, I can actually implement strong solutions as well. And then coming into implementing, then I've got sort of a few tips that I would say. So first of all, get senior leaders to make time. Often employers are saying our most valuable resource is our staff. Okay, so as a leader, are you making time to listen to the lived experiences of your intersectional workforce? And in doing that, you're creating a common forum where people will feel able to share, and maybe also, think about how do you then also brief your line managers to get comfortable with having the conversations with their teams. So, creating something that allows those line managers some confidence to start addressing some of these issues at the ground level starts making a huge difference, because all of a sudden staff will start thinking, my boss cares. Yeah. look at, at a more organizational level, start looking at your recruitment, retention, promotion data. What does it reveal about who is being taken on, who is leaving, why they are leaving, and who is getting promoted and why? And are those minoritized communities getting a fair crack at the whip in all of these areas? So also start thinking about, if you're going through a staff reduction program, and we know that a lot of employers are at the moment, then have you got in place objective measures so that those from minority backgrounds are not unduly penalized, because that can then have a severe impact on their mental health and well-being, as well as feeling as them being on the fringes. Now suddenly the little income that they were earning is starting to be eroded and perhaps being decimated, because they might get the statutory minimum severance from their employer. Okay. Also, in your onboarding of new staff, perhaps providing a tip sheet on finances and making clear what support is available within the business that allows them to be more confident in their finances, which is then one less stress factor for them to become a much more useful and productive employee within their workforce. And maybe this sounds radical, but it's not really. Undertake an ethnicity pay gap review. So I'm going to stop there, because I mean, I could go into a lot of detail into each of those, but that sort of gives some pointers into, how we can get leaders on board, how we can create a supportive working environment, and how then that takes the stress away from people or limits the stress that they may be experiencing.
Amazing. Thank you, Jiten. So again, a question for both of you. What are your top tips for employers and employees that they can do in the next few weeks to make a difference in their specific work environment? And I'll start this one with you, Jiten, please.
Thank you. So I've got 3 top tips. Okay. The first one is really start to normalize the conversation. People may ask, well, what is normal? But it's really about regularizing the conversation so that we destigmatize it. Can we start talking about well-being and the fact that, when we are in financial difficulties, that can have a severe impact on our well-being. Most of us cannot just leave our troubles at the door when we walk into the workplace. So if we can have conversations about it, then that helps us to compartmentalize that issue so that we can then put our energy into our jobs rather than constantly being distracted by it. Second tip would be, get some tips from your EAP, your employee assistance provider, in terms of what support might be available. So, and then make that widely available, and also advertise. If you've got an EAP, advertise it well enough so that people know it's a confidential service that they can tap into that will help them. And my third tip, really, and this comes into sort of better support around mental health and well-being for minority staff, but also it can apply to others as well. But maybe create a buddy system where people can talk to somebody else in the workplace, and if your resources permit it, then start training people within your workforce to become mental health first aiders.
Amazing. And same question to you, please, Bijna.
I think Jiten's given you all of the top tips, and they're all brilliant, I have to say. And look, I've seen many of them in action, and I really do see the value. I think in terms of things I would add, so the buddy system, yes, but maybe if we want to take that one step further, I've worked in organizations where you've had counseling. So it's your time. In fact, at least for the last 6 years, I've always implemented something called My One Thing, which is, in a 2-hour fortnight for in a 2-week window, you can take 2 hours, which is your one thing. Now, if that means you're dealing with a lot of stress at home and at work, and your one thing is 2 hours to go and watch a movie with your child, or to go to a counseling session, or to go to the dentist, that's your time and nobody can ask you about it. We respect in the workplace that that's your one thing, and it's for your well-being, mental well-being, and you do what you need to do without putting yourself into a pressure cooker environment. I've always had very positive feedback about my one thing, and so I've usually scaled it in the organizations that I've worked in. And look, I've tried it in different parts of the world, and it's received positive feedback. So my one thing / counseling would be one. The other is building on that piece around education and awareness. I think it's really hard to understand what someone else is going through until you stand in their shoes, and it's hard to step into somebody else's shoes if you don't have that context. And there is, something that I learned a few years ago that sort of stuck with me. I think we're quite often talking about how other people or other environments make us feel, but ultimately, how often do we pause and say, how did I make that individual or that group feel? How did I impact that meeting or that situation with my mood, my tone, what I'm going on with, what's going on with me, because it translated through my body language, my energy when I went into the room. And I think being mindful of self is a good way to start, because everyone's going through something. We don't see what we're all, what all the people in the room are going through. If we're dealing with Zoom, they say 70% of communication is body language. Well, even that's sort of out of the window to some extent. So start with that lens of, I don't have the full picture, I'll never have the full picture, but I need to think about how I come across and at least not add to a difficult day that someone may be having, and just be mindful and conscious that everyone's going through something at a point in time. And that links to the third point, which is empathy, right? There are lots of reports to say that the more automated we get, the more digital we get in the workplace, the super skill is empathy. So I think if we can train our teams and our colleagues and provide a construct or a framework where we help people bring their empathetic lenses to the workplace, realizing that we're all human, I think that will really start to make a positive difference.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for such insightful answers. Now, I'm really excited to move on to our audience Q&A. So I'll hand the baton back to Nuz.
Thanks so much. And yeah, lots of insight as you saw me writing away, because I'm a natural writer. So lots to take from there. But I just wanted to come to, I guess, the comments that we've gotten. So I think David King touched on something, and it resonated quite well when Bijna and Jitin had actually spoken there. It's about begin with understanding humility and common humanity. And I think that resonates quite well in much of what you've said. I'm waiting for a couple of questions to come through, and I might actually ask a question, because as you were speaking, I think it gave me something in terms of what I would like to ask. But I think just to summarize some of those really key points, I think just bringing it all together is it starts with that empathy piece, and the time is now. I think really great example, Jitin, when you said, to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is now. And I think this is what we really need to resonate with, is how do we normalize these conversations around what's going on? And I think this has been much of what we're trying to do through Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing, but also the purpose of sessions like these. How do we start opening up some, I guess, pulling back the plasters? And related to that, I guess my question is, and it is to either of you, or perhaps both of you, is I think, how do we create that atmosphere? And it's related more to DE&I, and I'll give you an example, that permission to ask questions. Because often I get approached by colleagues who are considered privileged, white, and they say the first thing is they actually fearful of actually asking those questions. How do you start actually? I mean, my advice has been, just start somewhere, and always start with saying, I'm trying to educate myself. So I guess starting with you, Bijna, perhaps you could answer a bit of how do you get because it's difficult conversations.
So the way I've sort of addressed this is in a more kind of organization-based framework, because I think we run the risk of making certain communities feel excluded if we side with certain communities, and that's absolutely not what we're ever trying to do by asking these questions. So I think if you say, for example, that, you know, we're open to creating diversity networks this year, you know, put your hand up if you want to create or lead a diversity network or be part of a diversity network. And then you can label them. You can have gender, you can have ethnicity, you can have religion, whatever it is that you want to do, LGBT. And then the people who will be willing to partake in that conversation to start with, some may just want to test the water and see how they feel. But then you've got a construct where you're not just singling out an opportunity to ask questions about one lens of intersectionality. And I think once you have that framework or that platform, it becomes very easy to discuss anything and everything that affects that realm. And so for me, that's always been one positive way of doing it that avoids you know, feelings of discrimination, positive discrimination in the workplace, because that's also a thing. And then the other side is top-down approach, right? So the top-down is the organization needs to have a conscious, clear commitment towards DE&I, needs to set out what that means and what that looks like. And that in itself will also create opportunities to be able to ask questions, but also answer those questions. And I think that asking and answering at an organizational level from leadership top down is also very, very important.
Thank you. Jitin?
Thank you. Yes, so I would, to add to what Bijna is saying, I would say that perhaps, you know, leaders need to discover the strength in vulnerability. Okay, and therefore, if I can show as a leader my vulnerability to my teams around, perhaps, you know, I don't fully understand some of the issues here, can you help me out? That gives a platform and an opening for people to start talking about their own lived experiences. And it requires me to then listen attentively and not just, you know, ask the question and then not pay any attention to the information that's coming back to me. And also recognizing where are the gaps in my own understanding around, say, wellness, and what am I doing to maybe re-educate or upskill myself in these arenas so that I can speak intelligently about them, and I can then encourage others to share their own experiences, their own areas for concern. Because if I can start addressing some of these things, then I'm going to get a much more loyal workforce, people who are not just going to want to leave, because actually they will start building a loyalty to my business, my organization, because they're feeling supported, they're feeling cared for, and they are feeling like they've got that voice as well.
No, thank you. I think that ties in quite nicely with some of the comments. So Brett has said attentive listening and use of language and how we present within the workplace is really key. And then we've got questions coming in, so that's great. So Akshay has asked, how do you create a sense of safety for employees when talking about finances involves disclosing quite personal information? Yeah. Matt, I don't know, or yeah, feel free to.
Yeah, sure. So can you just repeat the question again, please?
So how do you create a sense of safety for employees when talking about finances involves disclosing quite personal information?
Okay. So first of all, I would say that maybe this is something that I would take into a one-to-one meeting in the first instance, or I might have a town hall type of a gathering. So it's one extreme to the other in many respects. And in that town hall gathering, I might get financial experts to come along to talk about the fact that, you know, difficulties are being experienced. And, you know, I would really like to ask individuals to share hypothetical situations with me. And in sharing hypothetical situations, I can then you know, as that invited expert, start unpacking some of that to say, well, you know, you could do this, you could do that, maybe go to the money advice service, for example, and start pointing people into the direction of support that's available, both publicly and maybe organizationally as well.
No, thank you for that. I was going to get Matt's take on this, because I guess from Margie's perspective as well, I think there is, how do you create that sense of safety for employees? Because of course, this is something that you do in the everyday.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the evolution of financial well-being is following a similar trajectory to that of mental well-being. So if you look sort of five years ago, there was a stigma around talking about mental health. Largely because of COVID, it's now okay not to be okay. And there's a lot of conversations around the water coolers about mental health. I think we're still in the early stages of that with financial health and financial well-being. But we're seeing at Margie an evolution of that, where it's becoming more normalized to talk about your finances. And obviously organizations like Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing and Margie are working to sort of normalize that conversation, so it's easier to have.
And I think actually, just to add to that, I don't think in the first instances, feeding off what Jitin has said is in the first, it's that one-to-one conversation, and that someone doesn't need to disclose everything. When you create that psychological safety around the topic, and I think it comes to a bit of that vulnerability point, isn't it? When one starts sharing, then slowly people feel a sense of, okay, it's safe for me to share. So Birjana, would you want to add anything further to that?
I think you've covered most of it. The only other bit that I would add from experience is helping create spaces at work where employees can be candid in a protected way about their home situation. And this is, I talked earlier about being with surviving economic abuse. This is really where I've learned a lot of examples in recent times where, when you start to understand why someone's behaving in a particular way, all of their sensitivities to the different points of their intersectionality, so all the different components that are impacted by D&I, are heightened if they're going through something that's affecting any one of them in a serious way at home. And so that's one example. So I think to be able to get employees to talk about, I don't know, a birth, a death, an illness, a life event of some sort in a safe, protected environment at work with some specialist guidance, not on, what's the solution for this financially or medically or whatever it is, but we are here for you. I think that starts to unravel a lot of the bubbles that we see, but then we can't really, understand enough to be able to do something about. And I think given current times and the environment that we're living in, a lot of problems that we're seeing are very real. I was talking to someone from the homeless service last week who said case numbers across the country are 4x what they should be. So the government has an estimation, and the real numbers are actually 4x that, in some parts of the country even more. And we're seeing people go through very real situations which may have never seen in their lifetimes, don't know how to deal with directly or indirectly. So I think being able to get people to talk about the reality of what's going on, just express themselves, is where we can start.
No, thank you for that. And some good feedback as well. I think Michael has said this is excellent and informative, practical, sensitive. One area all employers could address is pay fairness. Part of being at the bottom is being underpaid, which undermines confidence, belonging, and engagement. I think very, very good point. I could have a whole discussion on that, on living wage, etc. James is asking, we know there is a stigma relating to mental health, particularly in some cultures, and this is compounded by the current cost of living crisis, as the most impacted may be inclined to ask for help, less inclined to ask for help or talk about it. How can we actively work to reduce the stigma and encourage colleagues to discuss? So again, I think it's on similar points as to what we have said and covered in terms of creating those safe spaces to be able to. We've got just 2 more minutes. I don't know if any one of our panelists wanted to, because I'm conscious of people's time and that. If I just give a minute each to each of the panelists to, I guess, close us off with just a few things before I kind of close off much of what today has been about.
Vishnu, do you want to go first?
So I think if I'm going to, and also just want to touch on the things you've said, Naz, right? I think there are some very important topics there that maybe in your future sessions that you can kind of continue this theme on. But I think just by the fact that we are raising awareness today, that you've started this series, that we're actually seeing that there is not only an interest, but a resonation with the audience that have joined us today on the linkage between DE&I, between mental health, between money matters. I think that in itself says that there is a very strong story here that needs to be unraveled with more depth, but also a framework that needs to be created. The work that I've done in banking and the work that I'm still doing with the charity that I've talked about already earlier, and even the UN, right, the delegation for CSW for this year, there is a huge focus on economic empowerment, particularly for women, because it's United Nations Women's Council. But ultimately, there is an entire narrative that our generation and this point in our lifetime is going to reflect back on in 3 years, 5 years, 15 years from now, which is what was that outcome of impact and correlation between DE&I and financial well-being and emotional and mental well-being. And I think we're at the cusp of something that's revolutionary to some extent. And if we can utilize platforms like this to define and frame it and give guidance to organizations on some of the things that they can do, but also then measure and continue to refine, we're almost sort of making history.
Excellent. Jitin?
So, great suggestions there, Bishna. To add to that, rather than regurgitate it, I would say that perhaps organizations who have the resources really need to create an outreach program into community groups and faith-based groups, where they can bring these topics to the community, because it's not just about the individual that works for us, it's about how they interact with their communities as well. And can we therefore start encouraging people to make these topics of open discussion in those community environments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was just typing the profound point around community, because I think, yeah, it's how does it extend out? So thank you from your part. Matt, I guess from my side, just if you'd like to learn more information, as everyone has stated, we want to carry on this in terms of series and that. I had put in a link into the chat. I'll put it back. If you want to find out more about Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing and some of these events, you'll be able to go on and register to find out when these events are happening. And then I'm going to just hand over back to Matt just to close us off, because we on time and we'd like to carry on. So over to you, Matt, to finish us off.
Thank you very much, Nuz. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Bijna and Jitin and to Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing for partnering with us today on this event. And I think, like we've all said, I think this is the start of a movement and the beginning of something that could be revolutionary. And really looking forward to following events, and please visit Let's Improve Workplace Wellbeing's LinkedIn group, and also Margie's LinkedIn group that we've just created. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you all. It's been a pleasure.